to me, Mr Chair.
Mr. Chair.
Dr David Clark.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Well, I join my colleague, Mr Robertson, in requesting that advice because they do seem to know a lot better than others, or they think they do, if we are to take this at face value. As I've suggested in my previous contributions on different parts of the bill, I think that this is actually about providing convenient loopholes. I really do. I find that the most plausible explanation for the higgledy-piggledy mess that we have here. And Mr Chair, I want to draw attention to some of the information supplied in the commentary on the bill that goes through the information exemptions under the regulations. And I want to, for those watching eagerly at home or listening to their wirelesses, those listening to wirelesses will hear the rustle of paper as I flick through. Those watching on the big screen will see there are pages of exemptions and amendments and definitions and so on required by this legislation that I contend would not be required if it was made the case that this was just a simple register of offshore buyers. Plain and simple. We wouldn't need complex descriptions of when a person meets the test and when they don't, and I refer here to Part 2, Clause Section 9, the amended Section 3, Subclause 3, page 11 for those with the track changes copy of the bill, and on to page 12, that defines what an offshore person means. And that means, and I'll read it out for those who haven't been following the debate, a New Zealand citizen who is outside New Zealand and has not been in New Zealand within the last 3 years, a person who holds a residence class visa granted under the Immigration Act 2009 and who is outside New Zealand has not been in New Zealand within the last 12 months, a person who is not a New Zealand citizen and who does not hold a residence class visa granted under the Immigration Act 2009, and then a series of regulations that will be created lie under the descriptions of a body corporate or an unincorporated body of persons and trusts, unit trusts and so forth. We have this complex system for describing it in the legislation, and then a requirement for regulation that sits under it, precisely because the government has exempted the main home, trying to exempt various categories of person from having to fulfil this requirement, because it is not actually interested in collecting a full database of who is buying and who is not buying. They want to appear to be doing something, but the only logical explanation for where we've got to as a parliament with this kind of weak legislation, these half measures, is that the government is doing this quite deliberately. And I wanted to look specifically at the types of person who would qualify under a trust, if I can find the right page, and I search madly through the many pages of description of who's in and who's out to find that offshore person. Let's look at the nature. A person will be described as offshore, generally speaking, non-individual when we talk about trusts and others. It's a body corporate. It's incorporated outside New Zealand. 25% or more of its shares are owned by a body corporate. You can see that these little tests that we've got along the way are going to require advice from accountants and others who will be advising people who are trying to get through loopholes in any case. You've got here a whole support structure for an industry of persons who are dedicated to foreign speculation and supporting foreign speculators in New Zealand. And that is precisely what we were told that this government was wanting to counter. And here we go. It's a partnership or other unincorporated body other than a trust, and 25% or more of its partners or members are offshore persons, according to those sub-definitions. And then we've got various subcategories of 25% and whether their voting power is exercised in which way and where they live. Trust or an offshore person, if it's constitute 25% or more of its governing body, or has a beneficial interest or an entitlement to 25% or more of the trust property, or 25% or more of those who have the right to amend or control the amendment of the trust deed, or 25% or more of those having the right to control the composition of the trust's governing body. So there's layers upon layers definition of a trust of who would be that in that 25%. It is a unit trust, Mr. Chair. Excuse me,
Dr. David Clark.
Mr. Chair. It's a unit trust, and an offshore person are the manager or trustee or both, or has a beneficial interest in or entitlement to 25% or more of the trust property, and so on and so forth. There are rules around the nature of the bank accounts that can be set up, whether they are the non-bank deposit takers or what people would consider regular banks, has to be specified in the law. The penalties, we've got a whole bit of legislation dedicated in part to, I think, to the penalty regime that must be set up to try and catch those people who don't wish to comply with the loopholes in the legislation, or do wish to find their way through the loopholes in the legislation. Exactly what kinds of ways through the legislation they can construct and not construct. And so overall, what we've got is legislation that does not achieve, and is designed, it seems, not to achieve the kind of register of interest that an ordinary person at home would have expected from this kind of legislation. When the whole Parliament sits here and spends a good considerable amount of time putting this through, when officials report to committees, when we have advice from members of the public, from the chartered accountants who as volunteers or as society members, the Law Society, put in submissions pointing out the much more logical way things could be done, and then over on the other side of the House we have a government who is either too arrogant to take that advice, or too out of touch, or somehow thinks that it will get away with this and people won't notice that it's making law that simply obfuscates and doesn't achieve what it is designed to achieve. It's part of a suite of similarly half measures. The Treasury, I think, estimated that 5 million in tax might be collected, and that was on the other accompanying measure when if a much more simple system was set up, 30 to 40 million in tax would be collected. They saw that there are holes in this suite of legislation that you could drive a bus through, Mr. Chair. So then in this document, the advice commentary on the bill, we've got advice around becoming an offshore person. For anyone who wants to become an offshore person, there's advice there. And the penalties, of course, are specified, as I've already said. Look, Mr. Chair, I want to draw my contribution to a conclusion by saying this is the kind of legislation that we might expect from a government that is trying to make it look like they're doing something, when in fact they are trying very hard to do nothing at all.
I call Stuart Nash.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much.